Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. I live in northern Illinois near the Wisconsin border. There are some who insist I am borderline, and it seems they may be correct. It is also true that I'm so conservative I can hardly turn left even when I'm driving. This is broadcast number 54, and we have Dr. Jason Moore on to discuss a critique of African American atheism. Stop, I say. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast. There you go. Try that.
Okay. Yeah. Once I get the share screen up, I can't control my microphone. So, yeah. Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow. Now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors tonight include the Bible Buffet, Not Your Father's Worship Experience, the Bible Buffet, and two great faiths that taste great together, Reese's Jesus Buddha Cups. And these sponsors, as wonderful as they are, don't pay all the freight here. So please go to our website, midwestoutreach.org, find the donate button. And if you like this program, or if you just want to inflict it on some people that you don't like, click the button and put some money in the can, and we'll keep it going.
Right, and we don't have a cha-ching sound, but we will send you a receipt, so that'll be not quite as good, but it could be interesting.
Even better.
And we have Dr. Jason Moore, and we met earlier this year, actually, at the International Society of Christian Apologetics Conference in Plano, Texas. Now, that's not plain old Texas, it's Plano, Texas. And he did a presentation on this subject, a critique of African American atheism. And I had also asked him to join us at EMNR, which happened a few weeks ago here in Palatine, Illinois. And he came and did two presentations, one on the same topic, a critique of African American atheism, and also one on Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, he has a book out on his adventures in Witness Land. But what is the title of that book, Jason?
Do you have them turned off here?
I don't. Oh, yes, I do. Hold on. That'll help if I. There he is. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
We can hear you now.
All right. The book is called Conversations Worth Having, and the subtitle is Insights from a Year's Worth of Discussions of Jehovah's Witness. Okay.
Insights of your. So you met with Jehovah's Witnesses. How regularly did you meet with them?
It was weekly, unless there was something preventing us from meeting. We met just about every weekend for over a year. Actually, it was about a year at the time of the writing of the book. Okay,
good. What kinds of things did you learn from talking with them?
One of the things that I learned, and this is one of the things that prompted me to do the writing, was I came to see someone about serving God, someone who really valued the Bible, someone who was sincere. And I began to see him in that way, as opposed to seeing him as a member of a cult or as someone who was trying to mislead me. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is how important I believe that is, to try to really connect with the person, to try to understand them, to try to empathize with them, as opposed to just focusing on getting the truth to them. I think both are important. Sometimes we focus, more so on the truth element than we do on actually trying to connect with the person. So that's one of the things that I would say I learned to do that. Because when we first started meeting, normally, as I think most Christians, my goal was simply to try to share the gospel with him and get him to leave the organization. But I came to see that a different process, a different approach perhaps was needed in order to try to have some meaningful interactions with him. And that's why I try to share that in the book, an approach that balances out sharing truth with actually caring and taking a genuine interest in the person.
So you basically expect us to believe that Jehovah's Witnesses are people. This is the basic idea.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I talk about how I originally really got into taking outreach to them more seriously. And one of the things that prompted me to do that was because I saw that as I talked to other Christians around me, I saw that they typically had one of two approaches with them. Either they would outright avoid them, or they would try to conquer them, meaning that when they did have a discussion with them, they would try to keep it as brief as possible by saying something to stump the witness that they couldn't respond to it, and as all they would feel victorious and feeling like they did what they were supposed to do. So when I saw that that was the trend, that those were the responses that were typical, I was convinced that there was a different approach that was biblical. And, that's the approach that I advocate.
I had a pastor friend, I say had because he's, I believe, gone on to be with the Lord. His approach was when they came to his door, he said, "Get thee hence, you servants of Satan," and shut the door on them. Literally, he would call them, "You followers of the devil, you servants of Satan." And that was his evangelistic method. He couldn't name anybody particularly who came to know the Lord this way. But you do. Why do you think it is that some people take that, either say as little as possible to them or blow them off with something like what my friend used to say?
One reason is because many Christians have not learned how to have meaningful dialogues with them. They haven't learned about Watchtower history or teachings. It's seldom talked about in our churches. And on top of that, the fact is they, like most people in society, they see them as burdens. They see them as people who come to their home unannounced. They come, especially on weekends when people are trying to do things and have time to themselves. So they see it not so much as an opportunity, but as a burden. And I think that in addition to that, a lot of believers who encounter them, they just don't have that kind of heart and passion for outreach to people. They are willing in cases to share the gospel with someone who may be down and out, or they're hurting, and they may be inclined to take more of an emotional approach in trying to reach those types of people. But when it comes to someone who is familiar with the Bible, someone who is coming to them, then I think a lot of times Christians just aren't ready for that. They're not equipped. They haven't really learned how to do this in their church. And so those are the two responses that they resort to.
Could there be an intimidation factor?
Yes, I think that's part of it. I think most people have a sense that Jehovah's Witnesses are acquainted with the Bible. They're well acquainted enough to be able to go to someone's home and try to teach them from it.
Mm-hmm.
And many Christians aren't equipped to do that. And so I do think that there is a sense in which they're intimidated by these people who are coming trying to teach them, and they know that they themselves are not equipped to teach someone.
Well, there certainly are some who would feel intimidated, but by and large, I have found that the Christians, quote, who are generally Christians, maybe are not as intimidated as they are feeling like the Jehovah's Witnesses are intentionally deceptive. That's a problem, as you point out. Your Jehovah's Witnesses are Jehovah's Witnesses for a whole variety of reasons, and so you can't narrow it down to one. And the deception of the leadership of the Watchtower doesn't necessarily mean the average Jehovah's Witness coming to your door is deceptive. That's one. Two, as you point out, they always come at an inconvenient time. Third, I think Jehovah's Witnesses have a sort of an edge on them because they expect they're going to be rejected. And so they come with a little bit of an edge already. And if you can sort of break through that barrier on a personal level, you can have perhaps more productive discussions. It doesn't mean they'll come to the faith, but Let me give you an example. I had a occasion some years back. A gentleman had contacted us. His wife was a Jehovah's Witness, and he wanted her out. As it turns out, he was an atheist. And so my first question to him is, why do you want her out? What are you going to replace it with? What are you going to take her to? And so he didn't really have an answer. And he had set up a meeting between us and her with him. And he lied to her about who we were, which made me very uncomfortable. And so when they arrived, we all sat and we started talking, and I'm trying to think, where do we even begin? And so in this case, instead of talking to her about the Watchtower, we never mentioned the Watchtower one time the entire night. We talked with him about the existence of God. Several things happened. One is she went from being distrustful to being our ally. Why? She wanted her husband to believe in God. Why? Because she wanted to become a Jehovah's Witness. We talked about a number of doctrines of different groups, the Way International and groups like that, cult groups. Never mentioned Watchtower one time. And then on her way home, he told us that she was completely silent. He was very frustrated that we didn't talk about the Watchtower. A week later, she left the Jehovah's Witnesses because, she said, she came to realize that these other groups were cults. They all believed the same thing she believed. She must be in a cult. She came to that conclusion on her own.
You're heading in a direction there, Don, and I was trying to get there too. There's another group that tends to intimidate people. Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, do sometimes. They don't always, like you say, Don. A lot of times it's a different issue. But I think when it comes to people who are tempted to just slam the door at them, I think some of them are covering for that intimidation. And another group that tends to intimidate Christians, in addition to cultists who know their Bible well, are atheists who have finally honed their arguments against the existence of God.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're here to talk about tonight, isn't it?
It is. I followed one of your little paths. I got off track there because I thought the book was interesting and people needed.
But you mentioned atheists too, so that's really what we're here for, right?
It really is. It really is, and a particular kind, which I was unaware of prior to meeting with Jason, is African American atheism. Is that different than average atheism? And what are some of the names that people need to be aware of that would be helpful?
Would Neil deGrasse Tyson be one of them?
No, he has not, to my knowledge, officially declared himself to be an atheist. I think at most he would be considered an agnostic. But in all that I've heard him say and write, I've never heard him admit to being an atheist. In fact, I think he purposely avoids that. But at the same time, obviously, he's not committed to a particular religion or belief system.
Yeah, he doesn't really mention any. So this is becoming a movement, would you say? Is it becoming a cultural force or a force to be reckoned with within the African American culture?
Well, I don't think it's a movement. I think it still is a very small minority of people who are sympathizers with this view. And I think that's one of the reasons, in fact, I know it is, that it still is so unknown, even in the Black community. So it's growing, though, because of the influence of the internet, because of the books, because of the speaking engagements and the different organizations that exist. So I do believe that it's growing, but it's not a movement, I think, in the sense in which it's trying to gather masses around this particular worldview.
Okay. So how did it come to your attention?
I was given an opportunity last year to teach a course entitled Religion in Black America. Because the person who was scheduled to teach it, they retired, so they need somebody to fill in. And towards the end of the course, I came across Anthony Penn's writings and his views. And as you see from the presentation, he focuses more on the aspect of humanism than he does atheism, even though he affirms that as well. But it was in that context that I first became acquainted with him and his writings, and then I learned about other people because one day I decided to just do a random search on our library website here, and then also on Amazon, where I did a search on Black Atheism. All of a sudden, all of these different books came up. And so I was surprised because I had not been aware of these before. And I make the point, even in the presentation, that other people who are involved in apologetics are also unaware of this, because when you think about the new atheists, you think about people, Anthony Penn and others in his community are not mentioned because they're relatively unknown. So up until last year, they were unknown to me as well until I had the opportunity to teach that course.
So Anthony Penn was a former minister, and he has a PhD in religion from Harvard. What do we know about his personal background and how he transitioned from? I don't know. I mean, I'm assuming he was a believer at one time, and is now, or claimed to be a believer, professing believer, and is now an atheist. Does he talk about how that happened in his case?
Yes, he describes it in great detail in his book entitled Writing God's Obituary. And the subtitle captures the essence of that, where it says how a good Methodist became a better atheist. And basically what he describes is there are several factors that contributed to his unbelief. First was being presented and challenged with questions about his faith that he could not answer. And this happened from friends. It happened from when he was in school, and he just could not find the types of answers that were satisfactory to him. And so this caused doubts, and this caused some concerns about, you know, what he had supposedly given his life to. But
now,
then
what sort of questions was he grappling with that he couldn't find answers to?
Well, one question that he mentions in the book is someone challenged him on the virgin birth, and they were challenging from the perspective of, you know, did he really believe that, and how could that really be possible, and just trying to get him to think about his faith in more logical terms, because he talks about when he was a minister, when he was a minister in training at a very young age, he had never been confronted with those types of things. You know, he had been thrown into ministry at a very young age. I would even argue that it was prematurely, but he was in this setting. He was preaching even. He had aspirations to become a minister full-time himself. So he had never really encountered the types of challenges to his faith because everybody around him was a part of that faith. Mm-hmm. So when he went away to school and he became more open to a broader society and found himself being questioned and having to grapple with some of the challenges of his faith and some of the things he had not been previously exposed to, you know, that's what started the wheels turning in terms of doubts originating in his mind. And then he also talks about the fact that he felt that people around him who were hurting, he felt as though Christianity didn't really have the answers for them. Like one of the things that he specifically talks about is encountering people who were, say, addicted to heroin, and how they would come to him for help, but he really didn't have anything to give them or help them with based upon his understanding of the Bible. And so that was another factor. He felt as though essentially there was no power in his message and no power in what he was telling people. And so as a result of that, you know, it just led him further down that road of doubt and feeling like, well, maybe there is nothing to this after all. So it was factors like that. It's learning, discovering more about atheists and humanists in the world, and basically just reaching the conclusion that he could have a meaningful humanistic life apart from being committed to Christianity.
You know, one of the things we have now, obviously, we come from different backgrounds. You can tell even just by looking at our pictures here. In most of the churches that are in our neighborhood, let's say, people are not well grounded biblically. They're believers, I think. They understand at least what the gospel is. But with the kind of seeker sensitive, seeker friendly, even emergent church motifs, teaching sound doctrine and actual discipleship rarely happens. And so people tend to become more socially liberal, and then their understanding of the faith revolves around kind of social, like, how do we deal with the drug addicts, for example? How do we make sure all of the poor everywhere in the entire world are fed? Not to say that those aren't issues that ought to be addressed, but those aren't the only issues that ought to be addressed. There's a whole spiritual aspect that doesn't seem to really be soundly dealt with from a biblical perspective. Now, is that true in African American churches?
I definitely think that that's the case. There is an emphasis on the difference that God makes. And I think that that's not only Penn, but some of the other writers of Black atheism. One of the greatest and one of the most significant criticisms that they have is, what difference does it actually make? And some of them, they talk about the bad experiences that they've had in church and how it just seemed as though, even though there were people there believing in God, worshiping God and serving him and so forth, when you look at the lives that they live, it seemed as though it doesn't make any difference. So going back to the one question about what's the difference between the general approach to atheism in the Black community versus, say, the new atheists of, Dawkins, Hitchens, and so forth, is that Dawkins, Hitchens, and many of those people, they tend to focus more on the scientific issues. They tend to focus more on what you could even consider the abstract components of believing in God, whereas the people like Penn and others focus more on the practical. What difference does it make believing in God? How is God's power and influence actually seen in the world on a regular basis?
Now, one of the things also that I think has contributed to this designation, new atheists, is that the new atheists tend to be aggressive, polemical. They're out there to make converts and to attack Christianity, not just question it, not just say, well, I don't, have enough. I mean, there's no evidence for God. They want to persuade others, and a lot of times they do it in a very, very belligerent way. Would Anthony Penn be one of those, or would he be a little bit more laid back in his approach?
Yeah, he's definitely more laid back. He doesn't use the type of offensive language that some of the writers, such as Richard Dawkins, is. But there is a sense in which they are open to recruiting more Blacks to atheism. For example, one of the books is entitled The Ebony Exodus Project, where it's focusing specifically on Black women. And the subtitle to that book is something along the lines of why Black women are leaving the church and others should too. So you can see, even from the way that subtitle is written, that part of the purpose of it is not just to explain why some have left and are leaving, but why this is a good thing. So there is a sense in which others are encouraged to join them in Black humanism and atheism, but at the same time, it's not as direct. Like I said, the language is not of the same nature as someone like a Richard Dawkins, and it's more about sharing their personal experiences and saying, if you've had similar experiences, you can relate to what I'm saying, then you might want to consider a new path, such as the one that I've decided to take.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned earlier all these books you ran into, and I'm going to show some of the ones that you've shared with us by Anthony Pinn here, but now you've indicated that there are others. When you said you went out onto the web and you found all these books, you meant more than just Anthony Pinn's books, right? You meant others as well, right?
Right. If you go back several slides in that presentation, you will see that I have a slide of about 8 different people who've written different books based upon that.
Oh, this one here?
So
Yeah,
yeah,
here we go.
so
All
you can
right.
see some of the titles right there, and you can kind of get a feel for where they're coming from just based on the title itself. Again, a lot of it stems from what they have experienced in their church experience and how unpleasant or challenging that might have been and discouraging. And it's not all practical. A lot of it has to do with problems in the Bible they talk about. They talk about the issue of slavery, as you can imagine. And so it's a lot that's discussed. But I choose to focus more so on Penn, particularly because he's one of the few that's actually considered a scholar in writing about religious matters and humanism and things like that. The others are interesting, but they're not necessarily on the same level as someone like Penn.
Now, in my perception, it seems that white liberalism has given the black church a pass. I don't know if this is, in other words, the white church is fair game because, you know, I mean, it's full of white people. I mean, after all, I mean, come on. I mean, right there, it's got a problem. You know?
And we are the ultimate evil anyway.
So, and you know, we basically are responsible for, you know, a lot of stuff. And the black church, however, has been associated with the civil rights movement, and so you know, black people can get away with saying things, you know, on television to secular white reporters that, you know, we would be kind of dismissed for saying,
castigated for, exactly.
Yeah, and so it's kind of been, this is again my perception here. I don't know if it's the same as yours, but the white liberalism is kind of left it alone, and I don't know, maybe snickered at it behind its back for its belief, for its naive beliefs, but they haven't dared to say anything about it. And now it seems because of that, this is leading up to a question, by the way. Because of that,
See, I warned you, rabbit trails.
well, no, it's taken quite a long time for something like this to emerge. How long has this been going on? I mean, these are a lot of books here. You've got not just Anthony Pinn, but you've got Candace Gorham, you've got Donald Barbera, you've got Jason Wynn, Norman Allen, all these authors. How long have these been in print? Is this going back 10, 20 years, or just is all this just exploded recently?
Well, they're recent in terms of the 21st century. You know, even Penn, he started to write until the 1990s. But one of the things that he does highlight is the fact that humanism in the black community goes all the way back to the times of slavery. And obviously back then, as well as today, it wasn't as common. It was still very rare back then, just as it is in modern times. But that's one of the things that he talks about in the one book, By These Hands, A Documentary History of African-American humanism, is he traces it all the way back to the period of slavery, where there were people who did not believe or were questioning or doubting the existence of God. And then you move into the post-antebellum period and then the early part of the 20th century. So here and there have been those who have been unbelievers. They may not have used the term atheist or agnostic or humanist, but their writings or their songs or their poems, however it was that they expressed themselves, you can see that
they were
that's what they were communicating.
Like in the movie Glory, you have that the one egghead African American. You know, he's joining up with the Massachusetts regiment to fight the Confederacy. And early in the movie, somebody I think mentions Emerson or somebody to him, and he goes, the Transcendentalists, you know. And so you see that what you're talking about, that there were literate African Americans in the antebellum. He would have probably come from the North. Maybe, I don't know, if he didn't sound like he was being portrayed as an escaped slave, probably a freed person, a freedman who was very educated, very well educated, and obviously
Douglas, who was an escaped slave, was very educated.
Who's this?
Douglas.
Oh, Frederick Douglass. Yes, very well educated. Douglas, yeah. I don't know if he was well, humanism is kind of an anachronistic term for the 19th century, but you can talk about when you talk about the Transcendentalists, you're talking about people who made man, who were kind of making man the measure of all things. That according to the movie Glory, there was one African American in the movie who was very familiar with their writings. So we don't think in those terms, and we tend to think of this as very atypical. And it sounds like you're saying it really still is atypical, but it's growing.
Yes, one of the things that I did the second time I gave this presentation was I some materials to it, and one of the materials that I added was a slide from a recent statistic, a survey that was done, I believe it was by the Pew Research Forum, in which they surveyed the number of Black theists in the community. Now, it may not be on the presentation that you have, but it basically said that less than 0.1% of Blacks are atheists. Over 98% firmly believe that God is real. So you still have, like I said, less than 1% of the Black community, among those, of course, who are surveyed, who would deny the existence of God. So again, it's not a widespread movement. It's not something that is highly influential. None of these authors have reached the bestseller status, and many Blacks in the many people in the Black community, Christian and non-Christian alike, probably will never even discover, let alone read, a lot of these books, but they're out there. And I think that as long as they're out there, as long as the organizations, the websites, and you have people like Penn and others engaging in speaking opportunities, their message is going to continue to grow.
All right, so it does need to be addressed. Now, Ron, as we get ready to go to a break, I just wanted to say we have a new viewer, Wawa TC, looks like, Aurora. Listen, she says, they write, listening while rocking my toddler, first live visit. Welcome, and we're glad to have you. And when we are done, you will know you have been had.
That's right.
Okay, Ron, word from our sponsors.
Well, yeah, our first sponsor this evening is the Bible Buffet. The Bible Buffet is not your father's worship experience, and you really need to check it out. The Bible Buffet, at the Bible Buffet, everything is designed to meet with your comfort and your convenience. Everything there is gluten-free, trans-fat-free, truth claim free, and everything is designed to cater to all different kinds of theological tastes. This week at the Bible Buffet, we have our regular Sunday specials: Arian appetizers, Sabellian succotash, Galatian goulash, mastic nut salad, and Pelagian pie. And don't forget, the Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. The Bible Buffet, not your father's worship experience. Okay.
Not your father's worship experience.
So, even though you say it's you said less than 1% of the African American community is atheist.
Less than 0.1.
Less than 1/10 of 1%.
Wow. Right.
And yet, these are a lot of books for such a tiny percentage. Publishers don't usually print something unless they think there's a market for it, unless they think they can sell it. So maybe they're being very optimistic. But
or who's buying it? Perhaps it's not being sold in the communities that the authors would like it to be. Perhaps it's more academic.
well, you take the one book though that says it's really trying to persuade the Ebony. I'm sorry, I don't have it up here.
Right, that's true. Right.
They're it's obviously trying to make converts. When you talk about this to other African Americans, are they surprised when they hear the information you present?
Well, when I discussed this content in a class, I still remember when we were talking about this in the class that I was teaching, and when I first introduced Penn, and there was a student, interestingly enough, it wasn't a black student, who raised the question about Penn and his perspective. And, one of the questions that he asked about was why, or how does he, speaking of Penn, how does he reconcile this belief rather in God with the role that believing in God has played in the lives of blacks for so many years and decades and even the last couple of centuries. So it did show that there were people who were interested in this material and who are interested to know more about it because of the fact that it's not well known. It's not something that you hear about in the news. It's not something that has been discovered. So I think as more people discover it, it will raise more questions. It will raise more interest. Ultimately, my purpose is to see more people provide thoughtful responses to it.
Okay. So do these people, are they bringing up any new arguments that have not already been batted around in the broader culture? Is there anything that Anthony Penn or any of these other guys that are saying, or men or women, that is unique? Are they bringing anything new to the table?
Well, in some sense, I think because they're writing from the African American perspective and the whole history behind that, one of the points that I make in the presentation is that one of the reasons given for things that contributed to atheism or humanism has been the ongoing presence of white Christian racism, and how that has contributed to not only ill feelings about Christianity, but ill feelings about the existence of God. So I think that is a unique perspective, and that certainly is not something that is talked about from the perspective of someone like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, because they don't come from that tradition and they're not in that experience. So I think that's one of the unique aspects that they bring, is a different perspective on history and a different perspective on what has actually taken place in this country and how that relates to the existence of God, who supposedly cares for all of his creation. So it's somewhat of a different spin. It does go back in a sense to the problem of evil in some respects. And just going back to what I was saying about the practical emphasis, what difference can we see in the lives of people who believe in God? And so one of the challenges, of course, in addressing that is thinking about history and how those who said they believed in God and they were followers of Christ, these were the very people who were enslaving people. These were the very people who were beating and killing and all of these things that took place. So that's a challenge that, like I said, I think they are addressing more so than some of the new atheists of today.
So, so in other words, well, okay, so I mean, we do hear a lot from the new atheists about just how bad Christians can be. It sounds like what you're saying then is that Penn and others are saying, look at how bad Christians have been to us. In other words, he's putting that, look at how bad Christians have been to our particular group. Would that be a fair analysis or a fair conclusion?
That certainly is part of it. In some cases, like with Penn, he doesn't limit it to that, but that certainly is part of it. In fact, one of the quotes that he listed, I think I have it in the presentation, is that what happened in the past actually contributed specifically and directly to humanism in the Black community because of what they were experiencing. So yes, that is part of it. But there's also the sense in which, going back to what I said earlier about, you know, his interest in desiring to help people and realizing, or at least believing, that what he was providing to them, the message of Christianity, really was not enough. It really was not making the kind of change. It really wasn't affecting anything helpful in the lives of people that he was trying to help. And so it just led him to the conclusion, or at least this was one of the factors that led him to the conclusion, that if this is not helping people, if it's not making a difference, then why continue to believe it? Why continue to push it on people if it's not actually going to make a difference in their lives?
And does he ever define what kind of difference he was looking for, what kind of help he was trying to give, what kind of change he was trying to bring about? Does he ever, what was that? What was he doing?
Well, one of the examples that he talked about was the people that he encountered who were on drugs. He mentioned heroin in particular, and how they would come, or he would encounter them in one way or another. Again, remember, he was a minister in training, so he was encountering all types of people, and realizing that in these encounters, the message that he would give to them, the help he would try to provide, it really did not accomplish anything. And so, I mean, it's almost like taking the medication. You know, if you take a pill that's supposed to make your headache or your pain go away, and it doesn't do that, well, then chances are you're going to discard that medication because it's not helping. And
okay,
I think
so Christianity didn't fix the human condition. People continued doing destructive things, therefore Christianity must be false.
well, that's part of it. Again, we can see the problem with the logic, but I think that was part of the, yes, that sense that there was just a real lack of power in what he was trying to share with people.
I was going to ask you, you know, on that, let's just take that one question, you know, Christianity versus heroin addiction. If Anthony Pinn were in the room with you right now, how would you answer that?
Well, I think going back to what Brother Don said, one of the points that I would make is that, number one, the message of the gospel is first and foremost primarily about sinners being reconciled to God.
Yeah.
By being forgiven sin. It's not ultimately about changing every aspect of our lives, especially not overnight. Now, I'm sure there are many people who have gone off drugs as a result of their faith in God and their submission to Christ. There have been people whose lives have been transformed because they've embraced the gospel. So I think that there is a place to affirm the change that Christ can make in the person's life. We see examples of this in the New Testament. We see examples of it in our own generation. So I think that there is a place to say that believing in Christ and follow him can and does make a difference, but it always happen on our and it doesn't always happen immediately. It doesn't always happen the way we would like for it to happen.
About 22 years ago, it's hard to believe it's been 22 years now, back in 1995, there was a kind of a little mini spiritual revival that broke out on the campus of Wheaton College. Lasted a couple weeks, I think.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
It was a very intense time. And I remember during this time, the college church across the street from the school opened its doors, and kids would just come in with their Bibles and pray, and they would sing songs, and they would have evening services throughout the week. And at one of these services, a guy named Lyle Dorsett got up to speak. He was a big expert on C.S. Lewis and things like that. He became a Christian in the mid to late 60s. And I remember him saying, you know, when I came to the Lord, I was a basically drop dead alcoholic. I was just totally, I was pickled in the stuff. He said, I was just I was probably very close to death. I was so deep into alcoholism. And he says, every once in a while I would come to meetings, where there was a spiritual outpouring like this. Somebody would get up and say, I came to know Jesus and he cured me of my alcoholism. He took away the desire for any drink anymore. He totally took it away from me. And he says, God bless those people. I wish I could say I had the same experience. But for me, it was a fight. It was a struggle. And, I think so much of the church right now, we want Jesus to be the pill that we take to get rid of whatever this
fix is right.
What is the besetting sin? And we want it to go away now. We want it to be gone today.
Well, right, and the church seems to feed that. Boy, the kind of testimonies you talked about, and other kind of maybe nuances that come from the pulpit or from small groups or whatever. It's unrelated.
Televangelists.
Televangelists, yeah, and not directly related to our discussion on atheism, but rather the cause that Penn seems to pick up on, that it doesn't, that belief in God doesn't fix things immediately. It's not the magic pill that makes heroin addiction go away. It's the same question with homosexuality. That I can't tell you how many homosexuals I have talked to or read who said, well, I came to the faith, I trusted Christ, I still had desires for same gender sexual relations, therefore it must be okay with God. So there's this perception that if I come to the faith, I will be fixed.
Well, and for Penn, it sounds like, well, first of all, I think we're establishing here that this is a distortion of Christianity to say that God will always immediately cure overnight your besetting sin, your addiction. We're presented with, Jesus saying, if you really want that, take up your cross, follow me. Paul says, put to death the deeds of the flesh. That means you kill them off. It's a struggle. It's a fight. It's an ongoing battle. It's not guaranteed. God does miracles. It's not guaranteed that you're going to get one. So I hope we're on the same page here. That this is to say that is the case is a distortion. And so Penn was really rejecting a distortion of the gospel message, wasn't he?
Yeah, I think so. I think he certainly had some misunderstandings about what to expect. And, one of the quotes that I have pertaining to one of his books is how he says that he rejected this belief because it wasn't offering any real help to people. And I think when there's a true understanding of what the gospel is and the difference makes and the purpose of it, I think that there's a different way to approach the problems and difficulties that people face. So instead of encouraging people to come to Christ because he's going to fix all of your problems, the true message is come to Christ because you need his forgiveness of sin. You need to be saved, and you need God's mercy. That's the ultimate message. And I think when you focus on the social element of becoming a Christian and following Christ, there's always going to be the possibility of disappointment, because it's easy to expect God to do this or to do that. And when he doesn't come through the way we think he ought to, well, then that can easily lead us to discouragement and doubt and even walking away, as Penn and others have done. So it's definitely, misunderstandings of the nature of God, of how God works and operates in the world, and ultimately how our perspective is supposed to be submitted to God and his will, as opposed to having any types of demands or expectations placed upon them.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're kind of creating a new faith in a sense, because the old faith that they're rejecting is a distorted one. So they're going to a new one, atheism, agnosticism, and and there's a sort of a mixing and mingling because they still have a sort of Judeo-Christian ethics and morals. In other words, we ought to live a certain way, but you don't get those. And this is back to a philosophical discussion. You don't get those from atheism. We have to borrow from a Christian worldview, and so you have to sort of combine these views together. And we have another situation like that. Ron has a word from one of our sponsors where they have combined two faiths.
Well, that is an interesting story, isn't it? One day, Rob Bell was walking along, not watching where he was going, and he smacked right into the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama says, "Hey, you got Christianity and my Buddhism." And Rob Bell says, "You got Buddhism and my Christianity." And then they decided that it's not all about truth, but experience. And isn't taste one of the best experiences? Two great faiths that taste great together. Reese's Jesus Buddha cups. You need to try them. They're great. Okay.
So back to experience, and that's kind of what we're talking about. Anthony Pinn left. Why? Because of experience. He wasn't experiencing what he thought the Christian faith ought to deliver. Therefore, the Christian faith must not be true. What is the point of believing in God if he doesn't fix my personal stuff immediately?
So what other arguments do they, you mentioned, the historic argument of white Christians and how they treated white slave owners. Just think about it. Didn't Frederick Douglass say that the worst slave owners were the Christians?
Yes.
The most brutal ones?
Yes, he had a lot to say about what he described as hypocrisy, from what he saw and experienced. And obviously he wasn't alone in what he experienced. And so, on the one hand, we can see the problem with focusing too much on experience. On the other hand, going back to what I was saying earlier about seeing it from their perspective, there is a sense in which part of the message of the gospel is transformation. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense in which, when the person becomes a Christian, old things pass away, all things become new. They become a new creation. So there is a sense in which believers are expected to be different. And in a sense, the validity of our faith, or the credibility of it, is established on the basis of that message being able to show that it does in fact work. So if a person is in fact born again as a result of faith in Christ, and that person's life changes, well, then we tend to give more credibility to that message. But if everybody who professed to be a Christian and everybody claimed to be born again and none of them were changed, then I think that would raise some concerns about the validity of their message. And I think that that is what some of them are suggesting when you go back into the past. And it seems as though, yes, you may have a lot of blacks even coming to Christ even during and after the period of slavery. But at the same time, there were those like Douglass and others who thought about it a little bit more deeply, and they were concerned about what they saw in the hypocrisy of the people who are professing to follow Christ. So I think experience is not the only test, but it certainly has significant weight.
Do they have, since you've read the material and I haven't read their material, do they have a sort of a truncated view on Christians in the past, slavery, for example, Christians in the past? And by that I mean this. Slavery started through Islam capturing blacks in Africa, black Muslims capturing blacks, bringing them to the shores and selling them mostly to English slavers.
Well, actually, the vast majority of slaves that were bought in those slave markets ended up in Latin America.
ended up in Latin America, right?
Yeah, we really were a small part of the market, but we had a lot of them, but we were a small part of the market.
Right. So yeah, my point is that most of the front end slavers weren't Christians even, and some, for example, I forget which hymn it was, but it was written by a guy who was a slaver, came to realize the gravity of the sin after he became a believer, rejected
Amazing
it.
Grace. John,
Amazing Grace, exactly.
that was John Newton. John Newton.
Okay. So you have that. In the South, obviously, you had a percentage who were owning slaves. But what about the anti-slaves? That's my heritage, was the anti-slave movement. Do they get any credit? For abolitionists. Do they get any credit from the black community for being abolitionists? I don't hear that. So I'm just wondering if that's even recognized as having happened.
Well, I think that approach actually strengthens one of the arguments that are used for humanism, because the point being is that, well, when you look at these tragedies that have taken place, we don't see God doing anything about it. What we see is other people getting involved, affecting change.
So in other words, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't argument. It's like if you see evil in the world, man did it. If you see good in the world, man did it. There's no room for God changing hearts.
And that's actually one of the critiques that I present, is that there's a disregard for the fact that God does work within the hearts of people, Christian and non-Christian alike, to move them towards his will. And so it could very well be the case that the good and the things that have come about in history have happened as a result of divine influence. And so that's actually one of the points that I make, that we can't just look for the miraculous, but sometimes we have to look at how God may be moving upon someone's heart to do what he would want them to do at that particular time. So that's one of the reasons why I highlight the progress that have been made among the black community. So yes, it has been the victim of great tragedies and trials in the past, but that can no more be used that God is not real any more than simply black progress can be established as being evidence that God is there. God is there in both and. So that's something that I think is important to communicate, that when you talk about what has happened in the past, you can't just focus on the bad and say that God was not there and therefore God is not real, because there are a lot of good and positive things that have taken place. And so the flip side to that previous argument would be that if there are a lot of benefits that have come about and changes for the better that have taken occurred, then we might as well say that that's evidence that God is there, that he's real, and that he's acting and very active in the world.
Okay. I mean, it's like what we tend to define as miracles, it has to be something that changes molecular arrangements or something, and we have to, it has to be something on the level of loaves and fishes, or turning water into wine, or walking on water, instead of the miracle of changing a human heart. It's what they've basically done is say nothing that man does can be used as evidence for the existence of God. And yet you have John Newton. He called himself a wild man on the coasts of Africa before he came to know the Lord. He had lots of money to be made in this trade. And one day he gave it all up and went into the ministry. I'm not saying he was a typical story. I wish there were more stories like his. But how do you explain that? How do you explain when somebody says, I'm doing a complete 180. This is a very profitable business for me, but it's wrong. It's immoral. It's unethical, and it's against God's word. And then he writes Amazing Grace. So that's simply inadmissible as evidence in the court of atheism, it sounds like.
Well, I think Penn and some of the others will probably respond to that by saying that what he experienced was more so the realization that like doing was wrong because it was harming other humans. You know, it was harming people, and he would not want that done to himself. And so he ultimately had a change of heart because he wanted to do right by other people. Not so much because he had some type of divine insight or that he had some type of inner working of God's spirit leading him in that direction. You know, there are people who don't believe in God, but yet they can still feel guilty about something, or they can feel bad about something.
Okay, so that brings
they
me back
turn away from that.
That brings me back to something that I raised earlier, and that is what would the basis for them to say that even slavery is wrong or harming someone is wrong if there is no God?
Right.
Where would you get such a moral or ethical premise to begin with? It simply would be
what if there's a higher good that is met by slavery? In June of 1944, Dwight Eisenhower had a decision to make. He could harm a whole bunch of people, or he could let the Nazis run Europe. And he chose to harm a whole bunch of people by sending troops onto the shores of Normandy and all those beaches in northern France. And a lot of people died. A lot of Americans died. To serve a higher good. And a slave owner or slave owners in general could say, and you know, some of them were just serving their personal good. I'm making a lot of money at this. But unfortunately, there were a lot of people who thought that slavery served a higher good, served a higher purpose. They had built complicated philosophical, economic views based on slavery. And so if you look at everything from a purely humanist point of view, what Don is saying is right. There really is no ultimate ethical basis for saying that slavery is wrong when you take God out of the picture. It seems more miraculous to me that a person will change his mind when his own personal profit is going to be lost as a result of changing it, than simply changing a philosophical view that doesn't affect his bottom line. It seems to me that it's more difficult to explain a John Newton than it is to explain somebody who just changes a philosophical outlook. But they seem to think that they've explained it, it sounds like.
Well, sort of, in the sense that, you know, just going back to that example, you know, the response I think that would be typical is, does John Newton care more about the slave trade and the problems than God does? Because if God is in the position to about change, you know, if God is in a position to end certain things and he does not do it,
Right.
then, you know, does that suggest that those who make the effort to do it care more about it than God does? So
really this really gets back to the classical argument about human suffering. How can God allow human suffering? It's really no different. It's just a particularly contextualized version of the classic atheistic argument.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there are different ways to approach it, you know, because again, we're talking about a topic that some would argue still has lingering effects to this day. So I think the issue has to be addressed both theologically and socially. And that's why I talk about the progress that has been made. because we can't just focus on what happened up until the 1800s. We need to think about what's happened since then. And we can't just focus on the bad. We also have to focus on the good and the positive.
Right.
And so,
because ultimately, this argument leads back to somebody saying that persistent migraine headaches are evidence against the existence of God. God shouldn't allow any suffering. And that's a bankrupt argument. As you just said, what about all the good? And also, what about sin? And the fact that God could have wiped out the human race right as soon as sin came into the world, and instead he chose to let us continue to multiply and fill the earth and send a savior. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's challenging. I don't they would say so much that God should not allow any suffering, but I think when it comes to extremities, I think that is where the problem comes. You know, for example, you know, if you have a child and you tell that child not to run on the concrete because they can fall and scrape their leg, you know, if they persist in doing it, there might come a time when we would let that child run on the concrete just so they can fall and learn their lesson. But I don't think we would ever allow our child to run into the middle of the street if a car is coming. So I think the point with that analogy is that, yes, there is room to allow for some things, but when it comes to massive tragedies, and when it comes to people that God loves and cares for being killed and being mistreated for years, decades, if not centuries at a time, then those are the types of issues that I think they have a difficult time grappling with. So yeah, it goes back to the typical problem of evil, but it is seeing it from a different perspective, where it's not so much just saying that if there was no free will, there would be no evil and suffering. We're talking about things on a massive scale that God has the power to do something about, and it's hard for some of them to understand why God would choose to not do something about some of these, like I said, large scale events and periods of history. So, but
and this is, I think, as Christians, we have to look at that and say, this is where the power of the Holy Spirit has to come in. The message we have is not going to be very flattering. The message we have is going to be saying the evil is not being inflicted on us as much as the evil is in us. And the evils that we experience are really very trifling in comparison to the evil we deserve in terms of the punishment for our sins. And that's not a message that's going to appeal to any atheist or anybody, but that's the message. And that's the message that the Holy Spirit has promised to bless and to use as a way of preparing people's hearts to receive Christ as the remedy to the solution of the evil in their hearts.
Well, you know what? And we are over time again, which is okay. Fortunately, we don't run into someone coming right behind us, but we don't want to wear people out either. So we're gonna have to kind of do a quick wrap up here. Jason, if anybody wanted to get a hold of you, would they email me and I could forward it to you, or how would you want to handle that?
That, or I do have a website where I have done blogs and other things.
Perfect.
So the website is www.jlmoorepage.com. That's JLMOOREPAGE.com. And there I have some information about books, some of the things I've been involved with, some links, things of that nature, some blog posts that I've submitted. about different topics in the past. And even on that website, there's an email address listed there.
And we began talking a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses. That sounds like another specialty of yours.
Yes, as I said earlier, I really got into that seriously when I began meeting with the gentleman that I had tried to reach out to when we were at an auto part shop, and I had no idea our conversations would last as long as they did. In fact, I was surprised that he continued to come, because in just about every session, I would present questions that either he could not answer or questions that he would come up with an answer with on the spot. But they were challenging. You know, they weren't so direct that they were attacking his belief system, but they were challenging in the sense that they were causing him to think more deeply about what we were discussing at that time. So in fact, it got to a point where we would laugh when I would ask a question. He'd pull out his notebook, because he would write the question down and say he would get back to me with an answer. And so it became like a joke between us because of the questions. But we met for a long time, and I came to see him as a friend, even, you know, not just somebody that I was trying to get the true gospel to, but someone that I would have a conversation with, and, you know, we would talk about other things sometimes. But that's really where that started, you know, just that long series of conversations that I had with him. And had we not ran out of material to discuss, we'd probably still be meeting.
Well, we'd love to have you back, and maybe you can talk about that.
Well, sure, I would love to.
Well, we will set it up. Ron, you want to walk us out of here for the night?
Yeah, we better take a little walk here. I gotta get it ready here. Here we go.
By the way, next week we have Pastor Phil Hernandez, also a member of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, and the question is, did Jesus exist?
Wow, that's people really ask that question. Okay,
yeah, some people do.
You just never know. All righty then. We got to give credit where credit is due here. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is just in case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygumus. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance is through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, which are both fully responsible for the content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. Well, thank you again for coming, Jason.
Thank you, and
very much, friend.
So your website again, one last time.
It's www.jlmorepage.com. Two O's.
And as Ron pointed out, if anyone out there wants to contribute to the ministry, if you like what you see, or if you don't, but you really want to irritate somebody else by sending them links to our videos, go to our website and click the donate button, and we will send you back a nice receipt. Good night, all, and we will see you next week.